Well, it was sometime last year that Ed Phillips, who is a pastor at Compass Church, formerly at Compass Church, because he's now semi-retired to Arkansas, but he told me, "Hey, have you heard of this book, You Found Me?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Well, it's like that dude that TEI had several years ago talking about." He said that Christian failure narrative that's a problem. And I said, "Oh, I'm already interested." He said, "It's a good book." And over the course of the last year, Rick, that church in particular has really invested in heavily in trying to, as an elder group and as a church, read that book and then to begin to apply in particular the strategy of bless as a result. So I know it's making an impact, and I wanted to continue to invite others to come in and join us. Did you help me with the admit, Rick?
I did.
Thank you so much. That's a blessing. Thank you. Jump right in. So,
Well, you had to talk, so I did the other job.
it's hard for me to do two things at once, and very limited in that. So anyway, do you know the name Brad Wright by chance, Rick?
Yeah.
He's a sociologist at the University of Connecticut, and he wrote the book called Christians Are Hate-Filled Hypocrites and Other Lies You've Been Told. And so he was here a decade or so ago and was the first one to really sort of alert us to this Christian failure narrative. And so your book, certainly along the same lines, says, hey, we may be self-prophesying and shooting ourselves in the foot. And so for that reason alone, I really appreciated reading it and have recommended it along the way. If you wouldn't mind, give us a feel for your motivations for writing the book. And then along with that, if you would, just an explanation about the sort of the elevator speech of what it's about.
Yeah. Yeah, so I I grew up in a in a very mainline environment, first Unitarian and then United Church of Christ, and actually embraced the kind of commitment to justice and social engagement and loved that part of it. But it didn't, for me, the churches I was involved in didn't meet sort of some of the spiritual core needs. And it was really through Youth for Christ and then Young Life, Youth for Christ and then InterVarsity that I came to Christ and got committed to Christ and got kind of on fire for Christ as a college student. And had, that was so profound for me that I went on InterVarsity staff, worked for a number of years, 25 years actually, with InterVarsity on campuses. I got to live out the kind of modern to postmodern and colonial age to post-colonial age dynamics that were happening and playing out on campus. I got to sort of see, I'd been trained by a guy named Paul Little on what you believe, and had been sort of taught that there were 7 questions that people who didn't know Jesus asked, and if you could just learn about the answers to those questions, you could have any conversation with any person. And that worked for a while. And then I was on campus doing campus ministry when that pretty much completely stopped working, that people weren't interested in those 7 questions, like the philosophical arguments that God exists, or the logical sort of thing where you're talking about if God is good and God is all good and all powerful and all loving, then how can there be suffering in the world? And people still ask similar questions, but they really are looking for completely different responses. Often, not always, but often, than the responses they were looking at from me on the ground. And so I just grew up with a heart to want to see people come to know Christ, and also to kind of get into their world enough to understand how to crack the cultural code. So my first book was Evangelism Outside the Box, which was actually the first book on postmodern evangelism that got published. And as the first book, one of the fun things about the first book is you don't even have to be that good a book in order to do well, because nobody else has really written on that or helped people with it. And so, so that was a beginning of kind of looking at culture shift, culture change, the shift in what had happened in the church, shifts in understanding of really power and both in race issues, but evangelism issues, and reflecting on all that. And as I reflected on it, I began to realize that a lot of the church, a lot of the evangelical church has felt marginalized and is fighting back from that, but also feels like, hey, we're up against it. We're up against the culture. We're up against people's attitudes. People aren't receptive to Christian faith. People don't trust the Christian church. And there's a kind of defensiveness that marks right now lots of the church, and maybe especially evangelical church in America. And there's also a lot of bad news that gets published, news about millennials all leaving the church, not trusting the church, about nuns, and it's the fastest growing religious group in America. They've now surpassed evangelicals as the largest religious group in America. And then also that, you know, the church is outmoded. It's the Christendom church. It's going to die within a generation. And there's so much of a sense of a negative narrative right now. And some of it's research-based in the sense that, yes, nuns are a new religious grouping, and they are now the largest religious grouping in the U.S. And there are a lot of millennials who have been, who have left the church, but there's some news behind the news that actually brings a lot of a different frame to the situation we face now. And so I really wrote the book. I didn't write the book to you know, have good news. I wrote the book to find out what's going on and to find out how receptive people are. And it's based on research. We surveyed 2,000 unchurched people across the country, every region of the country, urban, suburban, rural, Black, white, Asian, Latino, Latina. The Native American population in the survey wasn't big enough to draw conclusions about that group. But for all the other groups, there was a big enough sample to be able to kind of look at all that. And so we learned a lot about what the unchurched think. And then we actually surveyed 4,500 senior pastors of predominantly Protestant churches in America. And we identified the 60 that were experiencing a lot of impact through evangelism. And one of the I did want to just show you this one slide. I don't know if I'm not sure how many slides I'll show you, but I did want to give you this one at least. That and so if you can see that, I think most of you can. Yep. And so I know that there's the stuff on the side, but this was, we did this research and found out that in America, about 60% of the churches Protestant churches are plateaued or declining. About 30%, it's 31%, are growing largely through transfers, and 10% are growing largely through reaching new people through new believers, growth of new believers. And this was a haunting slide to me in a couple of ways. One way it was haunting is that 90% of the church in America is basically playing a zero-sum game. Some churches are plateaued, some are declining, and others are picking up people from the churches that are declining. And that's a zero-sum game in terms of the missional impact of the church in reaching and discipling new believers. And to me, that was a haunting, that was a powerful, that the church in lots of places isn't really very powerfully or impactfully on mission, at least in relation to making disciples that make new disciples. But there was also some good news in the research. 10% of the churches were growing largely through making disciples that make disciples, through reaching new believers. And one of the powerful things about that is that that 10% of churches didn't just have one particular church model, or they weren't seeker churches versus exposition-oriented churches. It wasn't urban or rural or suburban. It wasn't large churches or small churches. It fit the whole waterfront. There were churches that were liturgical in that group, and there were churches that were very casual. There were Pentecostal churches, there were seeker churches, there were very Bible-oriented churches. And so after discovering the diversity, we went and we interviewed 60 of the pastors of those churches growing primarily through making disciples that make disciples. And then we asked them for a new believer in the last year from each of those churches, and we interviewed 60 new believers in those churches to find out what was happening for churches that are making disciples that make new disciples. And that's been a powerful journey. The book came out of that. Part of what we found is that unchurched people are much more receptive to Christian faith than what some of the research was telling us. I can mention a few stats there, but I'm going to pause before I do. I'll go where you all would like to go.
Okay, let me, basically what we do, Rick, is I'll carry the conversation with you for about 45 or 50 minutes. And then about 10 till or a quarter till, then we'll open it up for others to speak. By the way, we have someone waiting whose name is Peter, K-O-C-H. Does anyone know that name? I'm not going to admit them because I don't know who they are unless someone, all right. So Rick, a couple of things I'd like
Rod,
to
that's
ask.
Elizabeth. She's accidentally on a Perspectives account.
Very good, thank you. Thanks for jumping in. All right, Rick, a couple of things. One is that what you, essentially you're saying is that there are some timeless principles that you talk about in the book that sort of go beyond any particular demographic or socioeconomic, et cetera, by identifying those kinds of things. So let me back up just for a minute and have a conversation with you about, I think we've talked quite a bit around here, especially given Brad's conversation about why bad news travels so quickly. But something that's been, that has annoyed me, that if you have an opinion on or perspective that you're willing to share with us and to let be recorded in this regional kind of way, is the ways in which the Barna Group participated through the years in sharing that bad news, and then more recently have sort of backed off and now written a book that's more like a positive, et cetera. So I know a little bit about how they're not a sociology study, but do you have any comment? Because it really annoys me a lot with the kind of authority and power that they've had through the years by not being really a research group as much as they are publishing and a marketing.
So Barna, David Kinnaman, I know him, and he's brought some needed transparency to what they're doing. He's built some good partnerships now with various clients. One of the challenges, Rod, is that you're absolutely right. Bad news travels fast and gets the headlines. So I'll just do a quick mention of one of those stats. Barna did a research project on Gen Z and on emerging adults, and found that 48%, the headline was 48% of Bible believing people of that age didn't believe in evangelism, didn't believe in sharing their faith. That's the headline that got all the press. And a lot of people have repeated that headline.
Right.
I actually wrote an article on Christianity Today, the Christian Exchange blog, saying that's not exactly what they discovered. They didn't ask, do you believe in evangelism? What the question was, uh, if you're with a person of a different faith, is it a good thing for you to share your faith with a view to changing what faith they have? Now, that is one dimension of evangelism.
Right.
And it is true, young people today don't believe they ought to try to convert people out of another faith to their faith. And that's what they could have said.
Right.
But it was a lot more of a very public statistic that almost 50% of Gen Z and millennials don't believe in evangelism.
Right.
Who are Bible believers.
In other words, the resistance to the question is more related to it lacks hospitality, it lacks compassion, it lacks love than it does with being heavy-handed and sort of proselytizing, those kinds of things.
No, that's exactly right. And that's what happens with bad news is partly it's the question you ask and then you generalize the question so that you actually can make a headline that everybody's going to go, oh my Lord, what are we going to do? We're in a crisis. But that's the headline that makes news.
Yeah, and I know that
so you have to be so.
Mm-hmm. And the organization that you're now
sorry,
with,
I didn't mean to.
Yeah, and the organization, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Institute, and in some cooperation with Lifeway are two sources that are doing a good job of bringing us the kind of statistics that care about asking the right questions that bolster the church as opposed to just selling books. Am I right about that? A confidence that I have?
You're absolutely right. No, you're absolutely right. Also, because we're at Wheaton College, there's a certain set of academic standards. There's an integration of sociology and of faith, and like those things are really important to us. And so we're careful. So we won't make as many headlines maybe because we're not looking for the spectacular piece of bad news, and then over accentuating that. But I will say, I mean, to be as I'm recording, I want Dave Kinnaman to know I appreciate him, the work he's doing, and I think he brought some balance.
Okay, so I can have more confidence than I used to have.
Yeah, I would say I would
corrections that he's making. Good. That's good to hear. I didn't know that, and that's good to hear. All right, I want to spend about 10 minutes personalizing you, and then we'll move back into the book and the material. So I have some just personal interest and questions because I actually came to know you primarily through my wife's reading in the area of healing prayer. So that's a subject that I had already considered inviting you to Central Missouri to consider before even this book. But I want to back up even farther at a 30,000-foot view. Just tell me a little bit about you and sort of, again, I want to spend about 10 minutes in this category, but just tell me, because you've had a wide range of interests. I don't really know what your particular academic pursuit is, in particular with Wheaton, how long you've been there, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I have three main passions that I've written books on. One is healing prayer. And I worked actually with a ministry for a number of years that did practice healing prayer. We saw God do quite a bit. I still work with healing prayer. I don't work with that ministry anymore. One of the things I found through my experience was that I needed healing from my time with a ministry of healing prayer. And I'm not alone in that. There are lots of us who have needed healing after our involvement with healing prayer. And but it's integrated into my life in very important ways. So I think a second passion is racial reconciliation and justice. I co-wrote a book with a woman named Brenda Salter McNeil, who's an African-American woman. She's pretty well known in racial reconciliation and justice circles. And that was very important. And we actually integrated the idea of healing prayer into racial reconciliation and looked at some of the false identities that I think people get into when it comes to racial sorts of issues. And then the third passion is really evangelism. And that's where I've done the most work. I joined Wheaton faculty in 2005 and have been there now for 15 years. and I'm a professor of evangelism and leadership. And I've loved Wheaton as a context because we really integrate faith and learning, sociology and theology, good stats with good stories. And I've loved being able to do that. Before that, I worked as a pastor of a church for several years, coordinating evangelism and discipleship. I love that they put those together for me. I don't like when they get dichotomized. I think it's a false dichotomy in some ways. Then before that, I was in campus ministry for a number of years. And that's where my love for apologetics got engaged. And that's where I watched culture shift happen and have to respond to that. So
where did you grow up? Where did you grow up?
I was born in California, have lived in Michigan, Vermont, North Carolina, Texas, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and now Illinois, Chicago, Illinois. So I actually spent 4 or 5 years in St. Louis, Missouri, and became a Cardinals fan there. And I'm sad a little bit about that. They didn't do that. They did okay this year given the COVID challenges, but loved being there. Was there for one of the World Series the Cardinals won and became a fan for life. So lived in a number of states. I have my PhD in intercultural studies from Trinity International University, and I focused on sociology as the discipline and the lens through which I worked on some of the intercultural studies kinds of issues. My focus is urban, and it's some of the race issues that we face in America. So,
a couple of questions. One is, you actually, I think, live in the city, and then therefore you have to go out to Wheaton. Of course, you don't have to go anywhere these days, I don't guess, but
that's right.
COVID. But you go out to the suburbs and then come back in. Tell me a little bit about that, if there's any story around that at all.
Yeah, so I mean, one in the book was, it was kind of interesting. We moved from Wheaton down to the South Loop of Chicago. And the South Loop is in between the Loop, which is a fairly rich and corporate area of Chicago, and Bronzeville, which is one of the historic Black communities. It hasn't always been African American, but our neighborhood is a kind of a mix between cultures and economic statuses and all the rest. And I love it as a neighborhood. I look out on Lake Michigan, but in my Marianos, I'm in a minority in terms of my race. So it's a great place to live. I expected to have people probably a little more hostile to faith. It's a young crowd, Gen Z, millennial. We have campuses in our neighborhood. It's also because the arts are kind of centered here. It's a LGBTQ population center, one of the places where lots live. So for me, for instance, when we moved into our condo, half the couples on my floor were gay, on our floor, my wife and my floor. And then down below, half the couples were lesbian. And that in Wheaton, that hadn't been as true. Obviously, that happens everywhere. But in Wheaton, the divisions were Catholic and evangelical, and then there were a few Democrats. I just kidding there, but there were a few people who took their kids to Montessori school and put signs for Democratic candidates, but that was definitely the minority. And it was mainly evangelicals and Catholics in my neighborhood, and they were receptive but guarded toward each other. The Catholics were afraid the evangelicals were going to try to make them Protestant, and the evangelicals were afraid that the Catholics, had these, all these beliefs that just had to be corrected. And so anyway, it was there was receptivity, but guardedness in that way. When I moved down to my area, my first experience with the gay couple next door was actually.
Let me interrupt you, Rick. Before you go there, because I know that story and I want you to tell it.
Okay.
But I'm curious about your motivation to make the move that you did.
Well, my wife and I are city people. She's actually a principal of an Hispanic preschool, predominantly Hispanic preschool. And we lived for a lot of years in the city. Then we actually went out to the suburbs because of some of the struggles our kids were having.
Gotcha.
And then we moved back. And,
got it. Okay, very good. Okay, back to the story. It's a beautiful story.
Oh, okay. Well, so I expected people not to be as, uh, I just thought like, so for instance, with our two gay neighbors, one of them was going to the University of Chicago and studying queer theory. And the other had been a former Catholic and had felt really judged and rejected by the Catholic Church. And so I expected them to be fairly negative, and I didn't expect to find a ton of receptivity. But one day driving home from Wheaton, I felt nudged by God to just get a spectacular bottle of wine and invite them over for appetizers and wine and see if they would do it. And so I texted them when I got back and said, hey, I got a really awesome bottle of wine. And also we have a few appetizers. You want to come on over? And they did. And one of them, the University of Chicago guy, he could be a sommelier, like he could actually give wine. So I was so glad that the nudge I felt was get a really spectacular bottle, because he loved it. And from then on, we became best friends. It was like he had us over the next week for dinner, then we had them over. And that next week when we went over for dinner, we got into conversations about relationships. And I gave a theory I have that people have to kind of recommit to their marriage every 7 years, because we become over a 7-year period, our needs change and we become different as people. And if you don't make that recommitment intentionally, you can tend to drift apart. And so anyway, we got into a big conversation about that. So afterwards, one of the guys came to me and said, could you and your wife, Mary Kay, give us relationship counseling? And or at least me. I don't know if my partner wants that, but I want that. Could you give me relationship counseling? And I felt like, boy, I'm going to be over my head here. I don't know. I hadn't done relationship counseling in that kind of context. I wasn't sure, if he and I would be on the same page in terms of the goal. And but they'd asked us. My wife and I really liked them a lot, so we said yes. We started meeting once a month, and this was probably 5 years ago. And we've met once a month with him actually now for 5 years. And it's been an incredible relationship. We've also stayed in touch with the two. They've now split, and his friend is now elsewhere. He still comes back to visit, and we're still connected, but just to visit. And but I have watched my friend from next door, just a couple months ago, he kneeled down in our condo living room and he gave his life to God. And he just kept saying, take my life, your will be done. And it's been incredible to watch his transformation and coming alive to Christ. And so now we're discipling, we're not any longer reaching out, and now we're really pouring into his life and praying for him. And it's been incredible to watch his transformation. And
That's fantastic.
But what I found, what I found is both of them were a lot more receptive than I realized. Now, it took a while, but even his friend ended up writing me a text and said, I really didn't think I'd be thinking about Christian faith like this, but I'm really exploring it now. And I'm really looking at this, and I really respect your faith. And I have now seen both of them express a receptivity that I did not expect when I moved in. And It's been beautiful to watch.
I like that. Let me set a little outline for us, Rick, in the remaining 20 minutes before we open it up for conversation or thoughts or questions. And that is, first of all, it's a nice segue. Let's just blink the bless idea. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the transferable principles of these 60 churches and the individuals and why they're vibrant. So let's give a sort of a commercial, and by giving enough that people want to go get more information. And then, and then I want to, it'll come to me. But anyway, there's a third thing that I want to do. So right there in the blessed portion, I just want you to know that as a result of the book and the church's encouragement for us to engage it, my wife made bread and we took bread to our neighbors. And so we have been, bearing some fruit relationally, no significant conversations beyond news, weather, sports to this point because of COVID partly. But we are now visiting and relating and we see some real prospects. So thank you for that. The E means in blessed means eat together. So I'm going to let you take off from there and whatever you want to share, but don't give away the whole ball of wax. They got to read the book to get the whole deal.
Yeah, so one of the challenges when it comes to churches reaching out, but one of the themes we saw in the churches, the 10% that are really doing that, is that a part of the challenge is when people hear the word evangelism, about 5%, at most 10, but often about 5% in any typical church get excited. And say, why haven't you been talking about this? We need to reach out. We need to, evangelize. And then there's a whole bunch of people that kind of are a little bit like, what do you mean? And what's going on? And they have questions about it. And then there's a bunch of people who feel just either guilty or tired or just check out. Well, if you're only getting like 5% of the people excited when you talk about that, then it's not like the churches that we interviewed, they really had their people excited about reaching out. And some of them actually were already using this idea of bless, but we have to give people a new paradigm and new language for what it means to reach out. Because the majority of people in our church would say immediately, oh, evangelism, that's not my gift. I don't feel competent at that. I don't feel comfortable with that. And so how do we help people really get excited and activated and engaged? And so it's really this blessed principle. This came out of actually the church I was involved in before we moved back into the city. We moved back into the city about 5 years ago. And it's Community Christian Church. It's Dave Ferguson, my friend Dave Ferguson. And he was trying to work at this issue of how do you get the everyday people in a church excited and taking steps and taking some risks. And so we basically came up with bless practices, the bless mission of God and the bless practices, bless missional practices. And to just say them real quickly, it's begin with prayer. It's, God's mission has always been to bless the world. And the idea is to help people understand that sharing our faith and just reaching out to people it's a way of blessing others.
Yeah.
And it's rooted in the Genesis 12 passage, when God says to Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. And through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so that's the blessed mission of God. And then the blessed missional practices that flow out of that are begin with prayer. That's B, listen. That's the L, E, eat together, serve in love, and then share your story and Jesus's story.
Yeah.
So when we bless others, like it gives people simple handles. It orients it around it. I'm not doing something to them, evangelizing them. That shouldn't be a bad connotation because that's good newsing people. That ought to be a good connotation, but for many people, it's not. No, I'm blessing people. And we have these simple missional practices. We're helping right now about 200 churches across the country and our cohorts embrace that, learn to use these, walk in this. And they've just seen so many good things happen as they adopt a paradigm of evangelism that's really quite powerful and winsome.
Yeah, it's so incredibly simple, and but it's challenging to be hospitable to those who live near you. And so I personally have been challenged in terms of, the privacy of a pastor's home, and when you're out in the public and those kinds of things, and when you get home. But really, the message is, no, your block is your responsibility. I was reading this past summer the Old Testament prophet John Golden Gate, formerly of Fuller Seminary, and he was just saying that at the heart of the Hebrew idea of justice and righteousness, it's not about caring about an abstract idea. It's very concrete, specific about meeting the needs of your neighborhood, and that if someone is at risk, whom so rather than this sort of general spirit of, the world ought to be a better place and people ought to care about systemic injustice, he was calling me, and through this article, and I was reminded of your book when I was reading it, that no, it's about asking the question whether or not Karen, as the single mom with the teenager down the street, or if Jim and the gay couple who live across the street, and the person down the street who's, whatever, that it's me to say, what are their needs? And that's really at the heart of what you're saying, is the magic of the vibrancy of this 10%. Am I picking up what you're laying down?
Yeah, that's it.
And everybody taking responsibility for neighboring in those kinds of ways. Yeah, go ahead.
It's just that, we've seen churches when they actually get to the point where their people are excited about blessing others, blessing the people in their neighborhood, blessing the people wherever they work and live and play. And they have simple ways to do that are handles. It's been amazing to see churches. We, one of our first churches we worked with in the last 4 years, they've gone from really feeling like they totally sucked at outreach to becoming what we call in the book conversion community, where they're just seeing a spirit of outreach fill the congregation. Their culture has changed. Their people are blessing people everywhere they are. And they're seeing people respond. 10%, over 10% of the attenders this year in that church are new believers in the last year. And if you can imagine what that does to the culture of a church when they're actually blessing others, reaching out, practicing hospitality, and seeing a lot of new believers. And
it reminds me of Tim Downs' work from years ago called Finding Common Ground. And his big idea was that we got to be about sowing, and we got to be about watering and cultivating, not just sort of reaping the harvest. And that's why I hear you describing is that the metric changes in these churches from counting how many people came to our church, or how many people did we baptize, or how many conversions did we have, to the metric that I hear you getting excited about is, hey, guess what? I got to have a conversation while I was on my bike with the gal who just lost her husband. Again, these are the kind of metrics that I'm taught, those are real examples from my own life, that I'm taking the time to stop at that yard sale to engage that, and to tell her how sorry I am about the loss of her husband, and to engage at that level. The metric changes, right?
Yeah, it's who did we bless, not how many conversions did we, notch up or anything like that. So who did we bless? And you bless by beginning with prayer. So one of the most profoundly transforming practices that our churches all adopt is that every 30 days they have in their leadership gatherings, they have their leaders talk about their blessed temperature. Is it high? Is it low? Tell a story of having blessed someone.
Yeah.
Through prayer, listening, eating, serving, storying, sharing. And then what's a step they want to take in the next month to bless someone?
Yeah.
And that simple a practice of encouragement, inspiration, accountability, that simple practice goes further toward helping churches change their culture than anything else that we've seen. It's an incredible thing.
I love it.
We feel fine about saying to people, are you in Scripture? Are you coming to church regularly, meeting with God's people? But almost none of us get asked regularly, how's your life of witness going? And one of the fun things about the Methodist movement between 1775 and 1850 is that they grew from about 1.5% of the church population was Methodist till 75 years later, 34% of the Christians in America who were involved in a church were Methodist. They went from 1% to 1/3 of all Christians in America.
Wow.
And what happened is they did it through their class system. And in their class system, they asked 3 simple questions. One is, how's your life with God going? How's your spiritual search going? And for a lot of people, you know, they had unchurched people in their classes. And they would talk about their seeking God, or they would talk about growing closer to God. Then how's your engagement with Scripture? And then how's your life of witness going?
Mm-hmm.
And those were the 3 questions, and they asked them weekly. And what we really encourage churches to do is ask your leaders those questions at least once a month. And you will be amazed at what will happen in the lives of people.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, when you mentioned the cohorts, and that was the third thing I wanted to ask you about. In those cohorts, what are some of the hurdles or paradigm shifts that you have to do with the pastors or church leaders who you're engaging to sort of, you know, cause them to repent and to see a new invitation along the way? Name just at a practical level what happens when you form a new cohort and what you know you got to get over in order to swim in a new stream.
Yeah, I think one of the initial things we have to get over is a lot of churches feel like they're bad at this and don't have a self-image that says, you know, we as a church could really make disciples that make new disciples. Like a lot of churches feel like they're bad at evangelism or bad at outreach.
So in other words, that's curious because you're saying that a shame-based identity is a part of the struggle that you have to overcome
Absolutely.
in order to get them to think differently.
Absolutely right. There's a shame-based about that. A second thing we have to help churches get over is that people aren't receptive. There's not a harvest. It's really rough ground out there. It's really hard to plant and sow and water and all of that. And what we found as we've worked with churches is it's a whole lot easier than people realize. That doesn't mean that it's you know, maybe a way to say it is it's simpler than people realize. That right now, there are a lot more receptive people than we think. And a lot of people will say, a lot of churches will say, I just don't have any friends. I don't, you know, I'm not hanging out with people. And I know in COVID, that's been an especially a challenging thing. But one of the most amazing things we see is that churches, as they begin to just have a monthly time of sharing about their life of witness, as leaders have that, all of a sudden they get the idea, oh, this matters to our pastor, this matters to our church, this is important. And then they start taking intentional steps and they find out they have a lot more opportunities than they think. Like there are friends, there are connections, there are family members. So often what we'll say, we have 4 statements that we work hard on, Rod, in the year. And one is, Frank is your friend. So F-R-A-N-C, Frank is your friend. Bless is your mission. Hospitality is your secret sauce. And community is your superpower. And those are kind of the 4 things we really work hard to get churches to be involved in. So I know at least some of you would want to put that up. And so you're going to say, man, you said that too fast. And so I'm going to share it because I just think this is a great takeaway for you. So I'm just going to show you it so you can see it. I just got to get my thing out of there so I can, okay, so here's this. And then I'm gonna just go down. So let me see. Now I gotta get you out of here. And I will just bring you right down to right here. Yeah, so here it is. Frank is your friend, bless is your mission, hospitality is your secret sauce. So Frank is, all of us have spheres in our life where we have friends, relatives, acquaintances, neighbors, and colleagues. Mm-hmm. And if we'll start becoming intentional about the way we pray for those people and look for opportunities to bless them, wherever we live, work, and play, we'll find out that we actually have a ton more opportunities than we realize. So Frank is your friend. And so every one of our pastors and all the leaders in our churches have a bless list. And on that bless list, they put on all the connections they have of people they want to bless. This isn't it's not a target list. It's none of that. These are just the people I want to bless in my life. And some of them are people who don't know Christ, and I'd love them to know that. Then we bless as your mission. That we just, every one of our churches, we work on helping them in blessing others in practical ways. And then hospitality is the secret sauce. I think you mentioned some of that, Rod, but hospitality is really the heart and soul of churches that are reaching people and blessing people today. That folks have people into their homes, and when you enter into their church, you feel like if you're unchurched, even if you're antagonistic, people wanted you there. And their experience of visiting these churches have some sort of entry point, whether it's their small groups or their missional communities or their services or whatever it is, their alpha thing, that's a basic Christian course. They have an entry point where folks who are unchurched feel like, wow, you wanted me here. I feel welcomed and loved when I walk into this space, not because I'm a believer, but because you really reach out. I talked with one church where it was definitely a conversion community. The woman who had come to Christ said, I walked into that church the first time with a kid that was really, ADD, bouncing off the walls. I spent my first 3 minutes just paying my entire attention, couldn't hear a thing about the service. Some greeter came up and talked to me for 5 or 10 minutes, put me at ease, welcomed me in, and then said, hey, I've got some stuff here that your child could play with. Why don't you sit over there? I'll watch your child right here, and then I'll come get you if there's any need at all. And this woman felt loved, and she was able then to concentrate on the service. That was a little church. It wasn't like they had all these facilities and bands and whistles. They just had people who knew how to welcome folks who didn't yet believe. And go ahead.
It so reminds me of what we were referring to earlier, just the heart of the Old Testament and the emphasis on hospitality, that to be a blessing to all the nations is so core to all of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Jesus told a lot of parables on hospitality, and one of the things Jesus made clear is hospitality includes the welcome you give to people who are not like you. Mm-hmm. Like that's a big measure of hospitality for Jesus. He said, you all, you entertain people that can entertain you back. But actually, hospitality's true measure is when you entertain people that may not be able to, wow, or that don't believe what you believe, wow, or that are a different race or culture than you are, or a different economic situation. And that's the true measure of hospitality. That's what we found in churches, Rod. It was really just story after story. And then the community as your superpower is, is every one of us needs people in our lives who ask us those simple questions. How's your life with God going? How's your engagement with the Word? And then how's your life of witness? How's it going blessing people? And community is your superpower. That will get you moving forward and blessing people like nothing else.
All right, before we open it up to questions or conversation from the rest of the group here with us, just a quick two commercials. One is related to the book, You Found Me, and it's a InterVarsity Press. I would hope so. You're on staff with them, huh? So good job there.
I was, that's right.
Along with the Billy Graham Center. About a third of the book is related to, maybe a quarter is related to the statistics, where you make the case sociologically that these things are true. And then a good portion related to the churches and some of the effectiveness of those 60 churches and the common denominators of those. And then an emphasis at the end about our individual responsibilities as well, and how we become personally missional, regardless of what our church is doing, which was, as I said, personally challenging, and it has reoriented some of the ways I do think and do my life currently as well. Yeah, so encourage people to get the book, right?
Woo!
Is it doing pretty well, Rick? Are you pleased?
It is. It had a great launch and has gotten around to lots of leaders, and I've had lots of chances to talk with people. I would say, in general, race books went off the charts in terms of sales, and outreach books went down some just because of the times that we live in. But it's still doing pretty well even through that. And then we have about 200 churches in cohorts, and they all are taking it to their elder teams and to their staff teams. And so it's been fun. It's been
how would any of the pastors or leaders, who's invited to a cohort, by the way, and then how would they find out more information about that?
Yeah, so I will put an email in the chat for you on that. Just contact this person. She's my right-hand person in terms of organizing all that stuff. Contact that person with questions, and she'll get you great information. And I'll talk with her about where it comes from. Basically,
is anyone invited? Any church or campus leader invited, or what's
any church? We do have some campus leaders. The thing is, it's a culture change cohort. It's not just here's some good ideas for you to pick and choose from, but it's actually really helping people lead culture change. So the senior pastor is one of the participants, and then an outreach influence leader or missional influence leader is the other participant from each church. Gotcha. And then they take the culture change vision and process and strategies and methods back to their church.
That's great. All right, well, thank you, Rick. Great to hang out with you for a bit. Let's open it up, and I think each of you know that that you can unmute yourself if you're in front of a computer. Typically, you can hit the space bar to do that. You could also throw your name up in the chat bar as well, and I'll call on you specifically if that's helpful to you as well. I know you get concerned, or I may not hear or see you. So let's go. Who wants to engage?
I have a question.
Yeah, good.
So what would you say to the just run-of-the-mill church member who wants to be hospitable and do all the things you're talking about, be a person of bless, but is afraid to offend those who they're inviting into their home with Christian worldviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I spent kind of a whole chapter on that, and You Found Me, because I think that is one of our challenges. And so I lay out a process of how to get into a conversation with people so that when you do start sharing your worldview and your Christian faith, you've first taken the step of getting to know them so that they feel like you get them and like them. One of our challenges is sometimes we're taught by the script to jump into our faith so quickly and to be so bold about it And so people feel, so a lot of people feel like that's too high a bar, and so they don't do it. But other people feel like, oh, I've got to blurt this out, or I got to get this out. And they're focused on what they need to say. And part of the power of the bless process is you start to pray, and then your next stage is listening. And you really listen until you get people and until they feel like you get them. And that's what I did with my friends across the hall, is I listened a lot before I inserted a lot about my faith. And by listening, they felt like I got them and liked them, so that then the first time I asked to pray for my friend who'd asked for counseling, he wanted me to. He couldn't wait to have me pray. Now, it's a little awkward. We hadn't done it before. So I just prayed a short prayer. My wife prayed a really short prayer. It wasn't full of religious language. It was just an encouragement prayer. And he loved it. And so that made him want to be prayed for again. And so it's that process of understanding people so that when we do share our faith, they actually feel loved by us. They feel like we get them. And they feel like what we're saying about our faith isn't some foreign kind of attempt to reject them. They feel loved. So that's where the bless practices really help people build the process, rather than have this script of what they have to say about their faith really right away.
Ah, good. All right, someone else?
So I have a thought. So now we're in this kind of dilemma of most of us, or a lot of us, are in this cautionary bubble. Yeah. And tell me what your thoughts are about as we go into next year. I mean, I don't think this is going to go away real fast.
Right.
And yet I see this as an opportunity.
Yeah.
And more so because a lot of churches are closing down.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously we've given a lot of thought to COVID-19, to how do you bless people in the midst of this. And we've also talked with lots of churches and pastors. And there's a few things that we found that are really helpful. I mean, one thing we know is that people have a lot of needs, and they're feeling that. There's a huge amount of receptivity right now. It's just we can't get next to people to find out about it as much as we used to be able, as much as we normally can. So that's our challenge. One way we've responded is that we've really encouraged people to go deep rather than broad. We all have relationships. Our circles of relationship have shrunk during COVID-19. But within those relationship circles, we all still have friends, past friends, relatives, people that we do have trust with already. And those are actually the most opportunity that we have, is actually in our circle where we already have trust. When there's crisis, people tend to feel cautionary, defensive, but they really turn to the people they already trust. And that's a huge place we can focus. Second, we found that neighborhoods can really thrive still in terms of caring for people, praying for them, out for walks, checking in on folks, finding out about needs. So neighborhoods, because so much of it's been stay at home, neighborhoods are a huge opportunity for us to pastor in and to care about and to pray for. So the neighborhood has become kind of a second major arena. And then the third is churches are really, as groups, some churches have really gone inward and tried to figure out how to keep the maximum number of people. But other churches have said, no, this is an opportunity for us to really look outward. There's a lot of needs in our community. So we've had churches set up food delivery for people, medication runs, kind of finding out where there are people that are shut in or have those kinds of needs. We have people that have actually advertised grocery runs and that kind of stuff. In my condo building, we've organized some around the people who have needs in our building. So there's actually ministry opportunities for churches that actually stay on mission and get beyond the crisis. And then the fourth thing we found is that COVID is going to be over at some point. And what we practice now lays the foundation for how God can use us once COVID starts lifting. And so all this stuff that we talk about with churches about kind of community is your superpower, Frank is your friend, bless is your mission, hospitality is your secret sauce. We're putting all those foundations in that we see some fruit from now, but that really poise us as COVID lifts to be really ready to walk into the new opportunities. So those are 4 things we found out about in the midst of crisis. The biggest challenge is people get tired, and when they get tired, they reach out less. And that's where community is our superpower becomes even much more important.
Good stuff. All right, others, thoughts, questions, or takeaways? Something that you'd like to comment to Rick that's been helpful about our conversation today? Something that you think you'll take with you or ponder further? Give him a little feedback. John?
I really like just the way to get a hold of it by using the acronyms. And in particular, what I found myself thinking is there's something under it that has to do with really just being eager to love, eager to serve, non-judgmental. It comes out sort of in your hospitality thing, but it really does have to do with a sort of a non-Pharisaism. So anyway, you might comment on that if you would.
Yeah, you are so right on. Both us in our research and Barna actually has found that that there are 2 big things that people who don't are unchurched fear. One is being judged, and the other is being expected to be something they're not. So if they walk in, so I have a friend, for instance, who had a neighbor, and the neighbor came over and said, yeah, I've been thinking about attending a church. And my friend said, oh, you ought to try ours. We love people coming as they are. We're really, you'll find a loving and a really non-judgmental environment in our church. And people have really liked that. And if you want to take a smoke break at the intermission, you ought to feel free. And, people at our church can feel free. And so that's the kind of phrase, that's a throwaway phrase, but it sent this huge message. Around us, you're not going to feel judged. And secondly, we're not going to have our all-in Sunday telling everybody's got to be totally committed. And if you're not, that's not, to be included, they have to be addressed. And so if you have all-in Sunday, then you got to say, hey, if you're unchurched or this is early and you're visiting at us, this isn't for you. But listen to kind of what we're trying to do to be all in to caring for other people. And that includes caring for you. So it's being aware of how messages sound. What can communicate judgment? What can communicate an expectation for people to be something that they're not yet? And those are the 2 big fears. Barna said, actually, unchurched people want to talk about spiritual things with someone who won't judge them. And the second thing is, there were a lot of friends that were Christians that they felt like, oh, I wouldn't want to talk about it with them because I think I'd feel judged. And that's so I love your question. That's just huge.
It's really the focus of chapter 10, bringing the community to church, is where you talk about how the church needs the posture, which is why you're including the culture influencers, the senior pastor is so critical. If it's about moving beyond your neighborhood and into the faith community that we call church. Yeah. Very good. Someone else? Another takeaway?
I'd love to say I love the idea of bless, like, the idea of who have you blessed today. I mean, that just feels, like you said earlier, it feels so much more attainable than who have you evangelized or whatever. I think that whole idea, thinking of it in terms of bless, but still with that kind of structure, trellis, maybe to see things happen. But it seems like it's more attainable than just the people who have been gifted with the gift of evangelism. So it's really good.
Yeah, that's so good, Luke. It's really good.
Someone else?
Since no one else is speaking, I just thought I'd give a little bit of a witness of how this really does work. And I think the strange grace of COVID is it is driving us to the neighborhoods. And it's simply this. We have several neighbors that we have that are, anyway, they know that I'm a minister of the gospel. And anyway, because nobody's going to be able to gather on Easter, this lady just walked across. I don't see her as particularly religious, good lady. But anyway, she said, would you lead a service and we'll keep social distance and we'll stand outside. And anyway, it's just an example of having set a tone that was inviting, So anyway, just thought I'd use it as an example. It's that easy in a sense.
I love that, Rod. The bishop at the diocese I'm part of, I'm Anglican, and he got asked by a neighbor the same thing. And she asked, could you do it each Sunday? And she's not even Christian, she would say. She's just kind of interested. But she actually organized a weekly Sunday service. He came out and stood in the center of the intersection of their residential neighborhood. And she went and got about 15 or 20 of the neighbors to come. And I think that's a great idea for Easter. Wouldn't it be cool if we just had lots of little neighborhood gatherings outdoors on Easter, if we're still in this, if COVID hasn't lifted. I love that.
That's great. Are you writing something currently, Rick? Are you still kind of pressing in on this subject?
No, actually, I'm glad you asked. I start my sabbatical in January, and I'm doing a next major research project. And it's what are the spiritual questions, convictions, and attitudes of diverse emerging adults, Gen Z and millennials. And we're actually going to interview African American, Latino, Latina, Asian, and also white emerging adults, 19 to 29. We're doing focus groups. We're doing a major national survey. We're going to compare. Often these studies have been mainly about white suburban emerging adults. And so I think it should be fascinating to see what we find out. But also we're doing it post-COVID-19, and we're doing it post with the kind of raise of awareness and racial issues. So that's the next major project, and I have a book contract for it, so that'll be out in a couple of years.
Oh. Tell me the difference between the Billy Graham Center and the Billy Graham Center Institute, or however you say it.
Yeah, so the Billy Graham Center is connected to Wheaton College. We now call it the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center to make the distinction with the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, which Franklin Graham runs, because it's not the same. Billy Graham founded both. He was the person who founded the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College, but that has a stronger academic side to it. So yeah, the Billy Graham Center is seeking to help the global church.
But what is the Institute? When you call it the Institute, is it separate?
Yes, it is. The Institute is the research arm of the Billy Graham Center. And that I direct the research arm, and I also direct all the stuff we're doing with churches. So.
Oh, very good. What's Ed Stetzer like as a boss?
He's a wild man. I don't know if you all have ever heard him. I like him a lot. He's been really fun to have around. He's a stimulating person to talk with, but he's also kind of a wild boss, because he's always rocking the boat and starting new things, and it's a wild ride, I got to tell you.
Good to have him on computer most of the time, then, huh? You don't have to do that in person that much.
That's right. Yeah, but no, it's mostly I really love the relationship, and it's been great.
That's great. Any needs that you'd be that would be appropriate for you to share with us that we could pray with you about in addition to the research? Any health issues or?
Well, actually, yeah, my mom just passed away about a month ago.
Oh,
And we're having a celebration service for her life a week from this Saturday. And our immediate family and some of the extended family will be gathering. So that's a really big moment for us. She was the glue of our family. We loved her a lot. And
was she nearby or elsewhere?
it's Phoenix, Arizona.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah. Well, we'll certainly join you in prayer. Well, thank you, Rick, so much. Let me give you the last word. And again, thank you for the contribution that this is. I think it's a lifesaver for churches that are dealing with the kind of shame-based identity. But beyond that, it's also was personally challenging for me. And I am changing my walking patterns, my receptivity to watching for neighbors, and looking increasingly for ways to invite people to come sit by our fire pit and someday into our living room. And, you know, for now I'm taking, I took homemade ice cream this summer over to some neighbors and those kinds of things. So it's, yeah, I want to continue to be challenged, and I appreciate the contribution that this book has made to that.
Yeah, I love encouraging people. I think, you know, for all of us here today, we can see so much more happen in our lives in terms of reaching out, not because we have a gift in evangelism, but just because witness is who we are, not just what we do. We're a witness to what God has done for us. And little tiny steps can make a huge impact.